Hi there, my name is Kim, and I'm just going to do a short video talking about fungus. Many of our clients are struggling with issues related to mold exposure, and so I wanted to just put together something that would be helpful to explain some of the ramifications of molds. So this video is really going to be about managing our exposure because there's no way that we're not going to have exposure to this kind of stuff. So let's just go through this PowerPoint quickly. So first of all, what is fungus? We end up using a lot of words interchangeably when we talk about fungus, but I just thought it would be fun to look and see exactly what it is. A lot of people are confused. Back in the olden days, it was classified as a plant, and so it doesn't have that classification anymore. It has its own separate kingdom that it's a part of. So, but if we look at the definition here of fungus, any of a diverse group of eukaryotic, single-celled or multinucleate organisms that live by decomposing and absorbing the organic material in which they grow. Okay, so that's a fancy way of saying things like mushrooms, mold, mildew, smut, yeasts, and also we also include in those, although they're not technically fungus, we also include things like slime mold and oomocetes, which are a water-based type of fungus. So there are roughly 6 million species. They can be very simple and like single-celled, or they can be complex organisms. Trees actually use fungal networks in the ground to communicate with each other. So fungus is a very important part of our biome. It is an incredibly useful and important part of nature, although how we interact with those can really make a difference in terms of whether they're helpful for us or not. So the other thing too that we need to talk about when we talk about fungus are the kind that are symbiotic, meaning that they work in conjunction with or they benefit the host, and then those that are parasitic. And so really when we're talking about fungus or mold exposure in this type of setting, in the healthcare setting, we're really talking about fungus that is parasitic or toxic to the body. So why is fungus so dangerous? Well, there are a few things that we can talk about on this topic, but first and foremost, God uses it as a form of punishment and discipline. So anytime that God says, okay, I'm going to take this substance and I'm going to use it in your life to draw your attention to areas that are out of balance, we really need to pay attention. What's curious is that if you were to do like a man on the street interview and you ask people what kind of things are they afraid of with health, you're going to hear, of course, viruses, parasites, bacterial infections. I bet probably nobody is going to say, oh, I'm worried about mold. When in reality, that really should be the thing that we look at the most. Because mold is such an integral part, not only of our environment, but because it's a tool that God uses. And if there's something that God uses, Satan will also use that as well. He goes, oh gosh, you're going to afflict them with mildew if they do this, this, and that. Well, good. So let's bring on the disobedience so we can really lay on the mildew and make them miserable. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword in that way. And we're going to go through a couple slides to kind of give a little bit more detail on some of these items. The other issue is that medical usage has increased our exposure. So, and then also EMF activity increases the toxic level of mold. So they've done experiments in Germany and showed that when they expose mold to an electromagnetic field like a Wi-Fi router or something similar to that, it actually makes the mold more toxic. And of course, our environments are more full of EMFs now than ever before. So, but let's just start with the scriptures here in Deuteronomy 28. Yahweh will smite you with consumption and with fever and with inflammation and with a fiery heat and with a sword and with blight and with mildew, and they will pursue you until you perish. So these are the consequences of living outside of obedience to God's word. And then in Haggai 2, I smote you and every work of your hands with blasting wind, mildew, and hail, yet you did not come back to me, declares Yahweh. So right there, we see that there's a direct correlation to mold in our environment and how lawless we are, whether that be personal lawlessness or whether that be societal lawlessness. And then, of course, we look at Leviticus 13 and 14, where God goes into a lot of detail with the priests on how they're to handle mildew or fungus that's on the body, clothing, and in the house. And when they would get mildew in their home, if they would clean the area, and then they would have to bring the priest in, and he would inspect it and see if it was clear. And if it was clear, then they could go back into the house, no problem. But if they couldn't clear the mold out of the house, they actually had to tear down the house brick by brick and carry it outside of the city gates. That's how serious a mold infestation was in those times. And unfortunately, we've really come a long way from understanding the effects of mold in the body. And when we look at chapters like this, we go, well, gosh, why does God care so much about mold that gets on things? Well, it's because he knows that it's harmful for us and he wants us to be as healthy as possible. So in regards to the medication, here's an abstract, the origin of antibiotics, where it says antibiotics and mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are the toxins that mold produces. So antibiotics and mycotoxins share many remarkable similarities in structure, metabolic roles, and biosynthesis, indicating their differences are primarily in the minds and economies of man, not the perspectives of the producing organisms. That's a fancy way of saying that when we take a mold toxin and use it in the pharmaceutical setting, we call it an antibiotic. But they're the same origin, they come from the same things. So every time you take an antibiotic, you are effectively increasing the level of mold toxicity in your body. Sometimes we need a good antibiotic because whatever that antibiotic is going to kill is more important than being concerned with the exposure to the mold toxins. But as we all know, the level of antibiotic use here in our culture is completely off the charts and has created so many other illnesses when it's really unnecessary the majority of the time. So some of the other issues too that we have to consider are articles like this from Discover magazine, where it says Frankenfungus armed with venom toxins could join the war against malaria. So not only do we have to deal with the naturally occurring fungus in our environment, but also scientists love to get their hands on these kind of things and start to engineer them so that they are more virulent or they can do different things that they were never really intended to do. So we have the engineered fungus that we also encounter here in a clinical setting. And then here's another article. I actually got wind of this a couple of years ago, and they just rewrote an article on this. This is, I believe, from June this year, June 2021. Deadly fungi are the newest emerging microbe threat all over the world. So there's a new species of Candida called Candida auris, and it's getting into hospital settings, and there is like literally no cure for this particular yeast. And they're having people that go into the hospital with one infection but end up dying. And they're actually talking about COVID in this particular article, how people would go in with COVID and then they would encounter this yeast in the hospital setting and never recover. They would actually pass away from it. So this is something that is starting to become on the forefront of a lot of epidemiologists, but by and large, doctors don't know about fungus. We have people that come in who are classic mold cases, classic, and their symptoms will go away within just days or weeks of starting an antifungal protocol. But they have been to every doctor, had every test. Nobody can figure out what's wrong with them because unfortunately doctors just are not trained in how to recognize mold in a clinical setting. So what are some of the symptoms of mold exposure? Well, yeah, kind of insert your symptom here. It's almost easier to say that there are not really any symptoms that we would say, oh no, mold couldn't do that because and I use the word fungus and mold interchangeably, although technically they can be different subcategories. Fungus can get into every system, into every part of the body. So it can produce a symptom related to every single area. The easiest, let me see, it can be the cause, mold can be the root cause of digestive problems, neurological disorders, pain and inflammation, cancers, hormonal imbalances, emotional issues, and that's just to name a few. A lot of times, though, the initial exposure will produce something like skin rashes or respiratory distress, headaches, stomach aches, and then a lot of times, if you don't catch it, then it gets into the system and then is free to pretty much spread wherever it wants to go. One interesting part is the slime mold, because the slime mold changes its form throughout its life cycle. So sometimes it's more like a true fungus, and then other times it's more like a parasite. And if you see slime mold in your environment, a lot of times this is like the yellow dog throw up foamy looking stuff that's in your mulch or in your yard. And when you go out in the morning, it's here. And then when you come back in the afternoon, it's kind of like maybe 10 or 15 feet someplace else. And so it moves. And so it does that in our bodies as well. So a lot of times when people have migrating pain, so like they wake up and their shoulder hurts, but then the next day it's in their elbow. This is very typical of slime mold. And so there are certain things that we start to look at and we go, oh yeah, that's pretty typical yeast, for example. One of the interesting studies that came out from the Mayo Clinic was they decided to actually see what is the cause of chronic sinusitis, imagine that. Well, they did a study, and as you can see here from the screen, they discovered that 96% of the patients, when they cultured their sinuses, were suffering from fungi. And as you can see there, with an average of 2.7 species per patient. So this is really fascinating because this study was published back in 1999. And I would guess, and the entire article was written in a way so that doctors could start to actually treat the cause of sinusitis, which of course, many times they add what? An antibiotic, which is adding more mold toxins. And so they said, hey, we need to treat chronic sinusitis as a fungal issue and start prescribing antifungals. But I would challenge you, there's probably nobody listening to this whose doctor actually treats them with an antifungal when they go in with sinusitis. So even though there are things that the medical community should know, because research has come out, it never translates into a protocol. So, and I would say that, and this is so typical of the stuff that we find here in the clinic, where somebody comes in and they think they have a bacteria or a virus, and maybe 8 out of 10 times it's actually a fungus, a mold, a yeast, a mildew, a slime mold. And as soon as we start to treat that, really things get a lot better. So let's keep going. Oh yes, so one of the other symptoms associated with fungal exposure is this entire concept of neuroparasitology. And I know this is the kind of stuff that nightmares are made out of. How you can get a parasite in your body and it will actually change the way that you think and behave. And this is not uncommon actually in other species. So this particular article is about a fungus that gets into the brain of an ant. and it will completely change the ant's behavior, and they call them zombie ants. So, but we also know that your typical parasite, for example, there's certain intestinal parasites that can change behavior, make you crave different foods and gnash your teeth. So one of the interesting things about fungus is that depending on the species and the part of the body that it starts to get ingrained into or begins to affect, it can change the things that you like. For example, you might your cravings of what you want to eat is going to be more inclined to be what's going to feed that fungus. The other thing that we see too is something called mold rage, where it can just make you very, very easily fly off the handle. And you might, think things or say things that you typically wouldn't think of. One of the other things that we've seen it do too is actually deaden the will of the person to fight against the mold. So, and this is when it's very extreme. But you'll tell somebody, okay, it's mold, and here it is in your house, or here it is what you have to do. And it's like they just check out and they don't ever pursue the stuff that they could do to get rid of the mold. And there's actually a book that I'm going to reference later in this presentation that talks a little bit about how the mold will change the brain. So the next area that we're going to talk about is something called MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone, also known as intermedin. And not only do we have symptoms that are related just to the fungus, but oftentimes fungus will lower this particular hormone in the body. And so we have symptoms that are caused by a fungal infection, but then we have the hormone that drops that creates an entirely different category of symptoms. So they're related, but they're not necessarily the same. So as you can see on your screen, this hormone is an integral component to our health. It's actually responsible for, I think, like 20 different processes in the body. But if we go through and take a look at some of the symptoms related to this low hormone, we have increased inflammation or inflammatory responses, pain, body temperature imbalances, including night sweats, sleep disruptions, changes in mood and energy, can be both fatigued or listless, but also easily irritable and agitated, memory and learning difficulties or brain fog. That's a huge one for mold people. Trouble gaining or losing weight, biotoxin susceptibility, and microbe overgrowth. So that's just like you're more prone to getting infections and not being able to get rid of stuff. Low libido, erectile dysfunction, excessive urination, dry mouth, reduced nerve repair, and digestive problems such as IBS, bloating, gas, etc. Another common symptom that we get a lot are itchy ears. People that have a lot of fungus often have itchy ears. So you can see if you have a mold exposure and then this particular hormone drops and you start to develop these symptoms, it really can feel like you're falling apart because none of these things seem to be related to each other. But when you step back and you get the big picture, then you realize like, oh, you mean actually like, all 10 of those things that I'm experiencing go back to one primary cause? Yeah, mostly. So when you can get rid of the mold, then the body will naturally restore that hormone, but it can take time. Other things that need to be considered are the MTHFR gene mutations. So this is a methylation issue. Methylation is very, very simply, it's how the body metabolizes vitamin B, for one, and then also how does the different processes in the body function that require this methyl molecule. So there are a lot of things that you can go in and research that on your own. How it relates though to what we're talking about today is that if you have these particular gene mutations, then it can greatly impact your detox pathways, so that you might be able to, for example, you can take stuff to kill the mold, but then your body can't process the toxins, and so it just gets built up over time. So we want to make sure that before we put anybody on a powerful antifungal protocol, that we make sure that they're able to detox the toxins that are going to be produced as they're killing off. And that leads into the die-off reactions. So when you start to kill mold, it fights back. It's an intelligent organism. And so in fighting back, it will often produce more toxins. And so it's not uncommon when you start to take an antifungal protocol that your symptoms actually get worse before they get better. This is completely normal, but people can get very frustrated. Headaches, nausea, stomach ache, fever, chills, skin. If you're taking, if your skin is reactive, your skin can get worse. There are ways to mitigate die-off reactions. So you can just go really slow, give your body a chance to process. You can add things like activated charcoal to help bind the toxins. So there are things that you can do to help. Although most of the people that I know, they don't care how that makes them feel for a few days. They just want to get rid of it as fast as they can. But it is something to keep in mind, so not to get discouraged. The next issue then is exposure. So we have the two main sources of exposure are through food and environment. Now, as I'm just doing this video and I'm breathing in the air around me, I'm breathing in multiple mold spores just with every breath I take in. So this is the kind of stuff that it's in the air. The majority of times our body is able to handle it. It's not harmful. We don't need to be worried about it. But if you are in a building where there's been any kind of water damage or leaks, old buildings that have it, maybe it's behind the wall, maybe there's a leak that you didn't realize behind the kitchen sink, maybe the carpeting flooded and it never dried properly. So it's possible that it can be in the environment. We have a lot of people who go to work and their offices have mold damage, or schools can have mold damage. And so it's important to keep our space healthy. And this goes back to Leviticus, how God said, you know, keep an eye out for mold. And if you've got it, then do these things to get rid of it. And if you can't, you need to go live somewhere else. That's how serious it is. Unfortunately, in our culture, if you do find mold, most people, they just put up another wall, paint over it, and want to kind of pretend like it's not there. And it is so dangerous to do that. The other thing then is food. And I'll go over different foods to avoid. But mold can be in all kinds of different food products. So it is important that you're watching to make sure of the integrity of what you're eating. But again, we'll go over a little bit more in detail about that. In terms of testing, there might be better tests now, but in the not so distant past, there was not a good test for mold. It's not like you could just do a blood draw or do a urine sample and they'd be able to see mold. It's very, very insidious. It can be very hard to recognize. And there are some doctors will check for the MSH level. There are other things that physicians will do, although here in the office, we use muscle testing, bioenergetic feedback. So that would be like the scans to find out. And then also we can really test, or we can really get an idea too, just based on symptoms. So if you're looking for like a very simple clinical test to tell you whether you have mold, unfortunately, they're just not a lot out there. So it's all about killing the mold and then detoxifying. And we can do that principally through herbs. God does not put anything in the environment that can harm us that he doesn't give us an antidote for, he doesn't give us a remedy for. So what's interesting about that is some of our most powerful antifungals actually come from areas in the world where fungus grows the best. For example, the Amazon jungle in India, and these warm, wet places where mold really proliferates, we have our very best antifungals. So here in the office, we use a lot of Paudiarco, cat's claw, graviola and cat's claw combination, neem, tairachi. There are a handful of different things that we use. It's very important that you get the right thing, because just like one antibiotic is not going to cover every bacteria that you can come into contact with, it's the same thing with an antifungal herb. That there are, for example, the neem seems to be really, really good with certain slime molds and mildews, whereas Paudiarco seems to work best for other things. So you really want to be able to identify the very best herbal remedy for that. You can also use essential oils externally. So clove, cinnamon, myrrh, thyme, a lot of your hot oils. And then of course you can use energetics, like here at the office, we use the Halo, which is a light device. We have a laser that's really good that has vials for the immune system. Right frequencies can be very helpful. And also you want to make sure that you're doing vitamin C or glutathione to help the body detox. Of course, here at the office, we also recommend IV therapy. So our IV nurse can put together a concoction of really good immune and detox supplements that are going to just get right into the bloodstream. So those are the main things that we do to help kill and detoxify. But this is a very short video. There's a lot of learning that you can do. And if you feel like you might be a mold person, I would highly recommend getting in touch with the different resources that we have on the screen now. There's the Moldy movie, I believe that's by Dave Asprey, knowthecause.com, momsaware.org. And then this book, When Traditional Medicine Fails, Your Guide to Mold Toxins. It's not very big. It's like this, it's about this thick. And there are lots of practical things to read about in terms of how to deal with mold, particularly in the environment. It's an excellent book. I recommend it for everybody. And then toxicmoldproject.com. So if you think that you might have a mold issue, then those are really reliable resources to start with. And keep in mind too, that if you are also allergic to mold, then you and 5 other people can walk into the same room and everybody else is fine. And within minutes or an hour of being there, you're the one that's going to feel like absolute garbage. So it's not in your head. It's just that you are more reactive. I have 3 kids. They all have different levels of mold reaction. My one child can go in and she can be in an area and she'll never get a symptom. Whereas my other son, he'll walk in and he'll know in minutes if there's mold there because he immediately starts to react with his sinuses. So not everybody is going to react to mold the same way. So foods to watch for. Corn is universally contaminated with mycotoxins. We eat almost no corn at home. And if we do have any corn, we try to make sure that it's organic and we just don't eat that much of it. And when we do have it, I'm always a little watchful for a few days to see, okay, is anybody going to react? So be very careful with corn. Keep in mind that high fructose corn syrup is in thousands of products. And so you really have to start to watch. I think cornstarch can also be a problem too. Sugar, mold and fungus loves sugar and sugary products. And so you don't want to fuel it by eating a lot of sugar. Peanuts, bananas, coffee, teas, oats. You just have to be very mindful and aware of when you eat something. If you react later, a lot of people think, oh, it's an allergy or sensitivity. No, a lot of times it's just mold. So the other thing too is to watch your coffee makers or any devices that you're using, like the water dispenser and a refrigerator, any products that you might have at home that you can't fully dry. are going to be an issue. So for example, we've completely done away with our coffee maker and we use a percolator because you can wash it, dry it, you're able to see everything. And so there's not hidden molds, tubings, and that kind of thing that are going to become full of mildew. The other thing is to be mindful of your mattresses and your pillows. You can get very, very toxic from having an old pillow. Your favorite pillow, you never want to, get rid of it. But then, if you were to analyze that under a microscope, you'd be horrified. So if you haven't changed your mattress or pillows for a long time, that's an easy way to reduce some of your exposure. If you end up having mold in your home, please use a mold remediator, somebody that you can be confident in their work. There are a lot of people that will just do a cover-up job, and it's awful. Also, no bleach. Please do not think that you can bleach mold and it will go away. It will not. It will make it so much worse. So no bleach. But what can you use? Enzyme cleaners like Benefect, TKO, Zymaway, Borax, usenzyme.com. You can find some of those products there. You can also use an ozone generator to fill the atmosphere, fill the air with ozone, which will help to clear the air from any kind of mold particulates that might be floating around. I highly recommend having an ozone generator available, and of course, a high quality air purifier. You need to try to make your space as healthy as possible. And again, you will never be able to avoid exposure to mold. It's everywhere. You're going to find it. It's going to find you. But the key is to be able to identify it early before it really gets in and causes chronic issues. And then being able to identify what you need to take to get rid of it, and just being mindful of where it is so that you can avoid it as best you can. So that is just a little bit of my mold talk. If you want to put a basket together or have some things on hand that you can just reach for when you suspect a mold infection, I would go back to that part of the video where it talks about the different herbs and essential oils that we use here. Always good to have those things on hand. So if we can be of any more assistance, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us here at the office. And in the meantime, shalom and stay well. Bye.